Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. We have one presentation for a subdivision tonight. It's for the preliminary plat for a 2-lot minor subdivision. One lot is 2.44 acres and the other is 1.56 acres. Both lots are in the R1 zone, though the northernmost lot has the Copper City Surgery Center on it by special use permit, which really means that a special use permit is something that could really go in any zone by review of the zoning board. So they reviewed it and determined that the space was a good one for a medical facility, and so that is how it is there. Here's an aerial image. You can see the surgery center to the north, and then this vacant piece is what's being proposed to be split into the second lot. And here's the zoning. The yellowish hue is the R1. This is what the plat looks like, the larger northern lot, and then the smaller southern lot, and then there's some easement for stormwater infrastructure right here. Or sorry, the storm infrastructure easement is up here. This is a picture before the surgery center was constructed, so this is the entire parcel as it is now. And then these pictures have the surgery center in it, and you can see the vacant piece on the back. Here's the surgery center to the north, to the south is vacant, and then farther south is the storage units. The Montana Code Annotated lists the primary criteria for which to review subdivisions. All of those criteria are reviewed in your staff report, and this presentation will review the most relevant. Effects on local services. Each lot is already or may be served by municipal water, sewer, and road infrastructure. They are proposing to construct sidewalk along the portion of Mount Highland Drive that's adjacent to this subdivision that doesn't already have sidewalk. The access to the northernmost lot is on both Mount Highland and Elizabeth Warren. Access to the southernmost lot would be to Mount Highland. Municipal water and sewer connection would be designed at the time that the lot is developed, and there's no proposal for that right now. The Public Works Department does not foresee capacity issues of the municipal services or roads in this area. There are 2 fire hydrants that are within adequate distance of the subdivision to serve it for fire suppression standards. Effects on the natural environment. All grades at the site are below 8% and they're relatively flat, so soil erosion is not anticipated. Native land could be impacted by new construction, though all disturbed land must be reseeded and reclaimed post-construction. Future landscaping would improve the overall soil stability at the site. There's no floodplain or floodway present on the property, and a weed management plan must be approved by the Butte-Silver Weed Board, which is standard of all subdivisions in town. Effects on public health and safety. Municipal water, sewer, and road infrastructure have adequate capacity to serve the proposed 2-lot minor subdivision. Sidewalk, curb, and gutter is existing along most of the adjacent portions of the property to a public road, but it will be constructed along Mount Highland where it doesn't exist already. And this subdivision is within the police and fire districts with existing hydrants located near the site. The subdivision complies with the provisions of the R1 zoning district. It satisfies the criteria outlined in the Montana Code Annotated and the Butte-Silver subdivision regulations. Therefore, staff recommends approval of the Three Sisters minor subdivision, subject to the conditions listed in the staff report. And that's all. Thank you.
That guy. Okay, great. Good to see you all in person. I was about to say there were no contentions with snow today, but I heard from Lila and Dylan that it was snowing earlier, so I guess we're not quite out of the woods. The drive over from Missoula was beautiful though, so I'm glad to be here in person and giving you an update. You've got a packet of paper unrelated to the subdivision you just reviewed in front of you, and I'm going to step through this the old-fashioned way because it's a little challenging to see up on the monitors, but for the benefit of anybody that might be online or listening virtually. So where we are at since we last spoke, you probably recall our hope was to bring you an audit report, the audit report last month. We are going to be seeing one another again next month with that document in hand, and you'll get the full PowerPoint presentation recommendations. The delay is due to a number of factors, not least of which were some personal things with my partnership, and so just, full mea culpa. We're moving through it. But as part of the recommendations, none of which I think you will find surprising, many of which we talked about in the presentation in January. The first and foremost recommendation is a complete rewrite, complete overhaul, reorganization. Let's do this thing the right way. So this that you're looking at in front of you is really the first step towards that recommendation, and frankly towards the beginning of drafting the rewrite itself. So we have been working on, and I preface this by saying it's a working draft table of contents, recommended table of contents. It's a functional document that we will be using in collaboration with Lila and Joella and Dylan over the coming months to workshop content related to the update. It by no means is set in stone. I told them earlier, this is going to change. It will change. It will not be the table of contents until the day the code gets adopted. So bringing this forth to you tonight is to get your thoughts and feedback and kind of bring you along in the process and what drafting will look like moving forward. But if there is, I guess I just want to reiterate the working draft of this document as we talk through it. So couple of things to be aware of. The color coding that you'll see, blue generally identifies chapters that will remain kind of the same in terms of their chapter structure, but will almost always involve new content and revised content. Anything in green is a new chapter that we are proposing, and in many regards will involve a lot of new content. Again, not all of that content that we're kind of showing here as subsections in each chapter will make it through to the final draft, but we're sort of at the everything but the kitchen sink point of this process. So we want all options out on the table for discussion. The 3 columns should be fairly self-explanatory, the most important being those first 2. So you've got what we're proposing as a reorganization, and then where the existing Title 17 content in the code today would fit into that reorganized framework. And this is really important because we fully expect, as we move through the next many months, that there might be questions from yourselves, from the public, from other staff and other departments, like where did that content go? We've moved it all around. Did you miss something? Did you forget something? And this is really our roadmap so that we can trace where content has been moved to, and then as we go through the revision process, justifying why something might have changed or been modified or been taken out. So think of it as a roadmap for the drafting over the next 6 months. I'm going to step you through the chapters very generally, and then we can have a discussion on anything that jumps out at you. or that you want to dig in on. So the first chapter, general provisions, should look pretty familiar. We've bolstered it a little bit. Right now it's a fairly puny chapter. So it's really geared towards setting up the purpose for the code, setting up its alignment with the comprehensive plan and the Uptown Master Plan and associated plans that inform the code, setting an effective date, severability, kind of the nuts and bolts. A new chapter, applicability and conformity, chapter 2, has a lot of existing content embedded in it, but it's going to go into a little bit more detail in terms of compliance with related regulations beyond just the zoning code, where you might encounter conflict between the code and those regulations, providing some guidance on that, but also looking at the reality that whenever this code is adopted, it will be adopted at a time where there are likely going to be current applications, development proposals in the works. And so we need to think about things like transitional provisions and vesting for those applicants that are going to be midstream when this goes on the books. So building that out a little bit more to provide clarity to both the applicant and to staff. Chapter 3 looks fairly innocuous. It's zoning districts. You have one of those chapters. You actually have multiple chapters because every single district is its own chapter, which is really unnecessary in our opinion. So what we've done is reorganized the new districts, and if you'll recall from our conversation in January, we had that table that looked at proposed districts, existing district alignment, and then how that aligned with the place types present in the comprehensive plan. So this is a lot of that same proposed district, existing district organization. We would also propose that we establish a section explaining the types of districts, because we might be considering overlays as well as base districts and performance or special districts as part of the update. So we kind of set the stage for the district type. We run through the new district configuration. And as part of that configuration or reconfiguration, one of the most important recommendations is restructuring of the districts. Right now, as standalone chapters, they have repetitive information. They list all the uses by district. They list all the bulk and dimensional standards by district. And what we'd propose is that we pull out those uses and we pull out those standards. And rather than repeat them for 40 some odd pages, we condense them into tables so that you can easily look at a consolidated table of uses. You can see the uses grouped by topic, so residential, commercial and mixed, industrial, ag, and then you can look at the districts across the top and see where a use is permitted or conditionally permitted in each district. And compare, contrast. It's a great snapshot. It's much more user-friendly. Similarly, we'd propose that be done for the bulk and dimensional requirements so that you can look at the districts and then look at massing, lot coverage, setback requirements, height minimums, maximums, and see what those values are by district. So you could perhaps easily assess between residential districts where there are differences in setback and height requirements, rather than paging through that really repetitive set of districts by chapter. So that's going to look a lot different than what exists today. But I think, in my experience, it becomes much more user-friendly and offers a much clearer snapshot of how these districts are configured and what uses are permitted, and particularly for those applicants that might be considering a zone change as part of a development proposal, they can maybe understand their options based on the permitted and conditional uses and the bulk and dimensional requirements associated by district. Chapter 4 is going to be quite a departure. And this gets into what we've talked about a little bit or a lot of it over the past few months, when we're talking about character and how to build in character-based design standards into the zoning code, particularly in places like Uptown where we want that, added level of just deference to character. So building types is one way that we can begin to think about the physical form of development on a property that's not simply related to use. So a good example of this would be, you'll see in the potential building types options on that far right column, and these are just ideas. We haven't vetted them through staff, and we're not proposing any, these are just examples. So in other codes that we've worked on, duplex is often considered a use. And duplex is actually a building type. The use is, a residential unit, a housing unit. So by regulating the building type in perhaps a zone that allows for single family and multifamily development to occur, where we allow duplexes, we can stipulate what that duplex looks like, whether it's a side-by-side duplex, whether we want to permit a two-story duplex, whether we want to do a single frontage duplex. And where that really comes into play is where you have a traditional neighborhood of single-family detached homes that might, because of, let's just say, a legislative change that may be forthcoming, now is required to think about incorporating two-family. You no longer can no longer restrict to single-family only development. So that's going to be something that we have to potentially consider as part of this update that every community in the state will be considering as part of their coding. And that can be really scary to a lot of folks that bought into a particular neighborhood with a particular character and want to see that maintained. Building types allow us to maintain that by saying, you know what, we have to allow two-family attached residential options in this district. They can go in a single frontage duplex, and that maintains kind of the built environment quality. It looks like a single family residence. The entrance for a second unit is on the side or in the rear of the structure. So the physical environment and the character is maintained. So building types really become a tool that help us regulate the form of the environment in collaboration with permitted and conditionally permitted uses, and maintaining those use regulations, not going fully to a form-based code, but thinking about the built environment and how we can maintain what we want where we want. I guess another example would be drive-through, because we heard a lot about the Dairy Queen drive-through uptown, and that was probably maybe a simpler example to provide, but you can allow coffee shops, banks, financial institutions, and not automatically allow drive-throughs. And so building types allow us to say, nope, you can't have drive-throughs in these districts. You can have them in other districts. So your coffee shop has to be in a structure. You can't have a drive-through. Anyway. The Chapter 5 on use-specific conditions, it's a new chapter in that right now a lot of these conditions are organized all throughout the zoning, so we're trying to consolidate in one place. But a lot of the content already exists. It will require some substantial revision. And again, we want to organize into topical buckets rather than just a running list of use conditions that are a little bit hard to wade through. So organizing by agricultural uses and use conditions, residential, civic and institutional, commercial and mixed, it should say mixed use, industrial uses, parks and recreation, accessory and temporary. And then any conditions associated with specific uses would fall under those buckets. Chapter 6, general regulations. This is a chapter that exists in the code today, but it's going to become much more important in the revised code, and then it will provide more detail on method of measurement, how you evaluate side and rear and front lot setbacks, how you determine lot frontage, depth to width ratios. There will be a lot of illustration that goes into this chapter to help convey those concepts. And it also includes transportation and mobility requirements, where certain types of street frontages and infrastructure, including multimodal, would be a requirement of development in a district. So it kind of lays the foundation for the general built environment that we then go into further detail in the following chapters, which the first few should look familiar. You have an existing parking and loading chapter, which we are keeping, reorganizing, adding some additional considerations for parking reductions, some access management, looking a little more closely at stacking spaces and drive-through design requirements, and then again building in some multimodal facility requirements as part of that chapter and potential parking offsets. We will be looking at, and it should have been in the notes section, but as part of the parking requirements and standards, we'll be looking at considering parking maximums as well as minimums in certain districts, just to kind of deal with some areas in the county that may have been overparked, thinking particularly along Harrison Avenue, south of 90, and what we might be able to do to facilitate as those properties are redeveloped, less of the parking dead zone in front of buildings. Chapter 8 is landscaping buffers and open space. You have landscaping provisions in the existing code. Again, they're kind of housed in this weird place under general requirement or regulations and scattered throughout. So we're pulling them into their own chapter and proposing to revise much of the content. One of the things we heard almost uniformly from the stakeholders that we met with in the fall and through the survey was there's a desire for more green, more landscaping, more natural amenities, and granted you have a very built out environment here in Uptown, but there are some ways and opportunities we can address that through non-traditional landscaping standards that we'd like to investigate as part of the overhaul of this chapter, just to respond to some of those requests that be a little bit greener visually. We've also not built in, but we've pulled in provisions on fences, walls, and screening, added a potential buffer, well, you have buffers, but tree preservation, as well as tree requirements. So all of these, again, are options that we'll be discussing and kind of looking at everything wholesale as we build this chapter. Chapter 9 is urban design and other development standards. And this is another chapter like building types that is going to be pretty much completely new. And it's where we see housing those architectural and historic preservation design standards that apply very specifically to the historic district and to distinct parts of Uptown and other places around Butte that have, some pretty unique character that we want to maintain. So the look and feel of this section is probably, as I told these guys earlier, it's the most amorphous to me right now, but as we work through that, I think we'll be, again, playing off of the desire to really preserve and protect some of the character and the environment that is really important to the community. Your sign chapter, chapter 10, it exists today. We're going to be looking at kind of overhauling it to make it a lot bit more user-friendly. and how the information is organized, how we're defining sign types, how we're allowing a sign program to occur on a property. So it will look and feel a lot different, even if a lot of the content is brought in from the existing chapter 42. And then moving on to chapter 11, we have environmental design and hazard mitigation. Right now, there is the water channel management zone, which may or may not live here when all is said and done. We have talked about potentially making that an overlay as opposed to a set of performance standards. That's all on the table, up for discussion to be determined. But for right now, it's housed under riparian resource protections. We're also wanting to build in, again, cross-references, and where appropriate, pull in information from things like the floodplain regulations, look at viewshed, hillside and ridgeline protections as appropriate, and also think about the wildland-urban interface and fire protection that may be appropriate within the zoning code for areas of the county that are susceptible to those risks. Chapter 12 is development types, and this is where options like the planned unit development, manufactured and mobile home parks, recreation vehicle parks and campgrounds would be housed along with their respective standards. We've also put in potential provisions for cluster development and conservation development. And again, these are just options for consideration to be vetted through staff and through you, but this is sort of where different development types would live and be referenced within the code. So rounding the finish here and moving into the more nuts and bolts of the code, we've pulled administrative and process provisions from all of the various areas they now live within the code into one chapter, so that process for an applicant is clearly outlined and lives in one place. You don't have to bounce around to 3 or 4 different spots to understand what you need to do, where, when, and how. This is organized in a way that focuses on the type of decision that's being made. So you'll see there are 3 types: administrative decisions and permits that would fall under that decision-making flow, legislative decisions, which include zoning amendments, both text and map, as well as a planned unit development if that remains as it currently is, and then quasi-judicial decisions, appeals, variances, changes to non-conforming uses, conditional use permits that would come before this. Well, some of them go before the Board of Adjustment. But this structure is one that we will need to talk through a little bit more with staff. We were just finishing the conversation before we came into this meeting, but that's our proposed organization, just based on how it has worked well and informed applicants in other jurisdictions. Again, we're not married to it. It's just, the flow that works, we think. Chapter, oh boy, my Roman numerals are chapter 14 is nonconformities. Again, you have an existing nonconformities chapter. We would propose adding some sections to expand upon potential nonconforming situations, and Butte is very unique in a lot of areas, so kind of thinking through all the potential nonconformities that exist, we just want to make sure that there's kind of clear provisions for all possible scenarios. And then 15 is enforcement and penalties. Again, existing chapter that will be revised and expanded upon, because right now what doesn't exist in the code in terms of enforcement is a really clear process for how enforcement is initiated and the steps that staff go through to get to the end of that enforcement process. And so just kind of building a clear, again, workflow in that chapter is what we're aiming for. And then finally, definitions. It's quite obvious we moved it from the front to the back of the code. Again, that's preferential, just so that you don't have to wade through 20 pages of definitions before you get to the meat and potatoes. But as I said when I started, all of this is up for discussion. So if at the end of the day we lead off with definitions, that's what we do. It's all up for consideration. So with that, no, that was a lot to throw at you, but it's kind of why we wanted you to have the working document in hand to review, pick apart, provide feedback.
Cool. Thank you for that overview. That was really helpful. I have some specific questions on the table of contents, but maybe to step back for a second. At the beginning, you said you think our recommendation is going to be a total rewrite. I might have missed it. Were we under any impression that it wasn't going to be a total rewrite? And is that change a timeline at all?
No.
Okay.
No. No, I mean, I think that probably wasn't the best choice of words. I think that's always been the expectation from the outset of this project. A total overhaul in terms of the organization and composition of the code, not that that wouldn't be expected as part of a rewrite, but there's sort of two trains of thought, and that we take, what exists today and we just rewrite everything as it's currently organized and laid out, but we're really only addressing content. And what we're saying is, and what I candidly told staff earlier, was that going through this exercise reinforced for me how confusing the code structure you currently have is for a practitioner, let alone the average layperson. So a total rewrite is really intended, like, we're just going to blow this thing up and move stuff around so that it makes sense and it's logical.
Cool. Thank you. And then another kind of higher level question, the summary reports, maybe that's not the appropriate word, that you're giving us next month. So we're in the assessment stage now, and the report is, can you explain that?
Absolutely. So, and that's where, because of a few unforeseen circumstances where we, the summary report, the audit report, the delivery of that report isn't holding up the beginning of our drafting. And I guess that's what I wanted to hammer home today, is that we're moving forward with kind of the reorganization and beginning this essentially work plan for drafting, because we know the recommendation for a complete overhaul is a pretty obvious one, and has always been since we started getting feedback not only from the stakeholder groups, but that survey and yourselves. So the composition of that report was, to be frank, and I don't think I'm violating HIPAA because, but one of my partners suffered a death in the family, and so just getting everything together has taken a little bit longer than anticipated. We want to bring forth that report in a complete format that that has been vetted and is acceptable by staff and can be presented to you as kind of a whole package. So that's the delay. The recommendations from that report are really a synthesis of, what we heard from the stakeholders, their priorities, our priorities, and a complete, it's a very complete assessment matrix of every single section of Title 17 with recommended changes and improvements. And so coupled with this, which is actually a component of the audit report you'll see. This is sort of like the next step. That matrix is really our marching orders, or our proposed marching orders for how we tackle this update. And so it's about, at this stage, unformatted, it's around 65 pages, because it's every single section and an evaluation of why it's working, not working, what's good, what's bad, what's ugly, and what best practice has informed us would be maybe a better approach to consider when we dig into that content rewrite.
Cool, thank you. So thanks for the high level. Maybe a question to you now. Is this appropriate to kind of ask detailed questions on this table of contents, or is that kind of too early in this process?
It's never too early. I think, yeah, detailed questions, again, because this is working. Our next step, I reviewed this with these three this afternoon, and they're gonna spend some time with it, and so your we'll just be working questions, feedback, considerations into a revised working draft and continue to move from there.
Okay, I have two, and then I will move on. On chapter 4 in building types, and then chapter 9, kind of the design standards, you had explained, I think, in the fall that it was kind of a balance to not have design standards so prescriptive that it's, overwhelming for staff, but still wanting to get some good regulation in there, I guess. Can you speak on that? And, do you think kind of this outline, can we still get to where we're looking to go without overburdening staff, but still require enough regulation to make it look like we want to look?
Yes, so the balance there is going to be in creating really clear standards that allow staff to say yes or no quickly. Like, is an application meeting this standard? Yes or no? Not, do we need to interpret this? Does there need to be a conversation? Are we, like, creating less opportunity for gray area, and I should say that's coupled with not overstepping into the design realm, into things like specific materials, colors, roof shingle type. That's not the level of prescriptiveness we're talking about. We're thinking more about orientation of the building, orientation of pedestrian access points, materials in terms of, is it appropriate that we require a certain percentage of different material types on a building face, so that we don't just get a cinder block structure. We have some differentiation, some articulation, whether it's by material or whether by structural articulation, to create a more dynamic street facade. We would talk about glazing standards and transparency. So again, rather than having a solid wall along a heavily traveled street frontage, particularly in a place like Uptown, we'd want to make sure that there was some transparency, especially in that first floor of a building, so that the street is activated, people can see into the building, there's more interaction between inside and outside. It's those types of things, and those types of standards typically have a numeric value, whether it's a percentage, whether it's square footage, that allows staff to say, yes, this is clearly meeting it, or no, they're not meeting the regulation. Not, oh, they're proposing blue instead of orange for their paint color, and we need to negotiate that. So that said, there is a recommendation in here that we look at implementing more of a zoning compliance permit process, which I view as enforcement on the front end versus kind of a free-for-all and figuring out that something happened that wasn't aligned with the regulations, and then we have to go through the enforcement exercise on the back end, which, as you all know, is challenging. No one's happy about it. Capacity-wise, it's a drain, and the effectiveness is not so great. So as we explore that option, I will make no excuse that it's not going to be a different process for staff to administer. But there are trade-offs that if we put a little more effort on the front end and perhaps reduce by 60 or 70% the complaint-based enforcement stuff that they deal with on the back end, that's a win. So it's just maybe a shifting in capacity when and how that review occurs, I would say. So.
Okay, thank you. In chapter 11, there was a category of Brownsfield, and so my mind just went to Superfund as well.
Yeah.
So just a comment, I don't know if that fits in Brownsfield or would be a separate section, but just something to consider.
Yeah.
If that's appropriate.
Yeah, I think so. And that, yeah, it could go either way. We could have Brownfield and Superfund separate. Kind of depends, again, as we work through what that looks like. I would say if there end up being similar standards, requirements, and process for both those, then I would just collapse them into one. That's kind of how I operate.
Okay, and then the last one, I think you answered this last time, but in the development of the comprehensive plan, we kind of took one chapter at a time and went through that.
Yes.
Is that kind of the game plan for the zoning rewrite?
I'm glad you brought that up. So, yes and no. That is what we are going to be doing internally as we draft, is sort of chunk this out. You know, off the top of my head, it's going to be like, well, chapters 1 and 2, we're going to knock out. Chapter 3 is going to be a bear. The design standards are going to take some time. What we would propose, what our team would propose, is that we bring to this group updates monthly in terms of where that drafting process is at, and topics that we need your guidance on as we're digging into content, and have a discussion about like some of the third rails. The chapter by chapter review of a document like this is a little bit more involved than with the plan. And so what I've seen work better is to bring you, in the course of 5 or 6 months, a complete full draft that you've been aware of as we've drafted and we've come to you with issues. But that allows you to read through it and see the big picture and kind of do a comprehensive evaluation. It's probably going to be a series of meetings that we chunk through your review comments, but you get to review it with all of the pieces and parts, because with the code, there's going to be a lot of cross-referencing between chapters. So it would be very hard for me to bring you chapter 3 with the districts that is going to cross-reference probably 5 or 6 other chapters. If you can't see those chapters, you're going to have a lot more questions than I have answers at that time. So if that's acceptable to you, that's what I would propose, but that does not mean we go away and you're not brought along with us as we're drafting. We'd like to bring you a complete draft for everyone's sanity.
Cool, thank you. All right. I'll pause and give other people a chance to ask questions. All right, I thought of one more. The Uptown Butte Master Plan calls for a lighting plan or lighting standards. in the future, if there is a lighting plan developed or some other plan of kind of that type, is that new regulation, is there a process in this to be adopted, or how would that work?
It would fall, so if there's a lighting plan requirement that we need to cross-reference or integrate, I think right now, it seems most appropriate to fall under Chapter 9, subsection E, which is lighting. And it's very general, because right now, the code doesn't have a whole lot on lighting. So I think we'd work it in there, as far as what's required where, when.
Would there be a process to modify this if the lighting plan came later, or some other regulation came later to include in this?
Yes, so the process would be a text amendment, and I don't know off the top of my head, Dylan or Lila might, the initiation of a text amendment, I think that could be done by staff or by this body. And then it would just it would follow the statutory process for a text amendment.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. So right now, text amendments can be proposed by property owners, this body, the council commissioners, and you may have seen one recently, but yeah, there's a whole section in this proposed, and there is in the existing zoning code that it deals with modifications of existing regulations. So the intent is that it's dynamic, that this isn't a code that we adopt and then keep for 60 years like the last one, but that we are able to evolve and it can change as we change.
Okay, thank you. All right, I have no more questions.
I have a question.
Mr. Daly.
So you mentioned some potential or possible legislative, is this too early for this question?
No, it's not too early.
Can you give me an overview or give us an overview of that, please?
Sure. I can't give you an overview of every single bill. I will admit I sit on the legislative committee, but I don't have the number of bills that have been proposed this session and the actual numbers. However, there is one that I believe has been signed into law by the governor. It is definitely on his desk, and it has been one that we've tracked through the session, that eliminates single-family only zoning in municipalities. And that has been a conversation that is being held nationwide. A lot of the jurisdictions I work in outside of the state of Montana, their states are having similar legislation proposed or has already been adopted in the name of zoning reform. So it's not a concept unique to Montana, but it is a conversation that we are likely going to have to think about as we look at the districts and the district composition as part of this code update. And you would have to do that whether we were going through this process or not. The benefit in being midstream and about to launch into drafting is that you are ahead of most other cities in the state, and yeah, you'll be able to meet whatever comes out of that statute. It's been approved. I feel like if I could Google search real quick, I'd be able to tell you. Maybe Lila can. But no, do you have anything to add? No. Yes. Yep. Yes. The allowing accessory dwelling units by right. Yes, that is, yep. But that's again where the building types can really come into play in terms of size, scale, location, placement, orientation. You know, there are ways that we can make the most of, that legislation that's imposed. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. It does look like it was House Bill 245 that was it's allowing for mixed use and multifamily in municipalities. It has not been signed yet, but it's pending reconciliation. Mhm. Yeah, there's been a nationwide push towards zoning reform. It has been driven by housing affordability issues universally. I think something we'll want to continue to talk about, particularly through drafting and as the public is engaged, is that while we have to follow statute, and we will be required to do certain things, likely following the session's end, zoning is really only one tool to create housing affordability. I think that that's something that I see people fall back on a lot. Like if we open the floodgates, if we make, more development more accessible, it will automatically become more affordable. And that, in the places that it has been done, has not been the immediate result. It requires other tools to support that. We can reduce regulation or increase mixing of uses, but without other incentives, it, you know, it, no. So I think that's a reality that we kind of need to manage that conversation and be realistic with what this code can and can't do. So.
Thank you. Any other questions or discussion? Thank you for your very detailed and thorough presentation, as always.
You're always welcome. I'll look forward to seeing you guys next month.
Thank you, Allison.
Thanks.
All right, I don't think we have anything else on tonight's agenda, so we could take a motion to adjourn. All in favor? Aye. Motion adjourned. Thank you.